The flames were everywhere. Orange tongues of fire devoured the city skyline, thick plumes of black smoke choking the air. Sirens howled in the distance, but they weren't moving fast enough. And inside the towering inferno of the Varades central spire, thousands of civilians were trapped. Screaming, begging, waiting to die. The emergency crews had frozen. Not because they were cowards, but because this fire was not normal. The living inferno. This wasn't just a structural fire. This was a plasma outbreak. The kind of fire that ate oxygen faster than it could be replenished. The kind that melted steel into liquid within seconds. The kind that had never been stopped before. Not in Varades history. Not in any history. The moment the fire had reached the core fusion lines of the tower, it was already a death sentence. The Varades firefighters, some of the best-trained emergency crews in the sector, knew this. And so they stood, helpless, outside the raging inferno. Because there was nothing they could do. You're just going to let them burn? The Varades Fire Marshal, Commander Trelvex, had made the call. We evacuate the surrounding areas. No one goes inside. The alien fire crews, some with 6 arms, others with biothermal resistance scales, all nodded. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't abandonment. It was physics. But then, a voice cut through the chaos. Oh, steady, unshaken. So you're just going to let them burn? The fire crews turned. And there, standing alone in the smoke, was a human. Dressed in black turnout gear, streaked with soot and ash. A breathing mask slung loosely around his neck. His face was calm. But his eyes burned like an inferno of their own. His name was Ethan Cole. And he was a firefighter. The alien's warning. Commander Trelvex's mandibles clicked in irritation. This fire is beyond our control, human. There is no way inside. There is no saving them. The other Varades firefighters nodded. Even the best in the galaxy had accepted that this was a fight they could not win. Ethan just smiled. And that smile unsettled them. You're wrong. Trelvex's eyes narrowed. Your body cannot withstand the heat. The structure will collapse in minutes. Your species has no biothermal shielding. Ethan rolled his shoulders. You think I don't know fire? He took a step forward. I've run into burning skyscrapers before. I've pulled people out of collapsing buildings. I've crawled through smoke so thick I couldn't see my own hands. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Fire doesn't scare me. The Varades firefighters stared at him, because they believed him. The impossible decision. The fire was spreading. Heat sensors flared red. The building's outer walls were seconds away from structural failure. Trelvex turned to Ethan. You'll die in there. Ethan's response? A slow, steady exhale. Maybe. He clipped his breathing mask into place. And then he ran into the fire. The firefighters creed. The moment Ethan crossed the threshold, the heat hit him like a solid wall. The air shimmered with the intensity. His fire-resistant suit could only do so much. But Ethan knew something no alien here understood. Fire was predictable. Fire could be beaten. He didn't need biothermal shielding. He didn't need advanced alien tech. He just needed his training, his instincts, and his refusal to quit. Through the inferno, Ethan moved low and fast. The flames roared, trying to choke the oxygen from his lungs. But humans had adapted to fire for centuries. Stay low. Move fast. Trust the heat flow. He pushed forward. Through collapsing walls. Through blinding smoke. Through a burning nightmare that should have killed him. But he didn't stop. Because ahead, past the heat and flame, he could hear them. Trapped in the inferno. The Varades civilians were huddled together in a reinforced safe zone. It wasn't enough to stop the flames. And they were seconds from running out of oxygen. One of them, a young Varades mother, clutched her child close as the fire closed in. Her eyes filled with despair. Because there was no way out. Then, a sound. Boots hitting the floor. A figure emerging from the smoke. And in a moment of pure disbelief she saw him. A human. A firefighter. A man who should have been dead the moment he stepped inside. But there he was. Standing. Breathing. Ready. Who here needs a lift? The first rescue. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved with purpose. Grabbing children first, then the elderly, lifting them onto his shoulders one by one. The Varades didn't understand. How are you still alive? Ethan just grinned. Because I don't have time to die. And then, he carried them through the fire. Outside no one could believe it. The Varades emergency crews watched in horror. They had expected Ethan to die within seconds. But instead, a figure burst from the flames, carrying 3 civilians. Then he ran back in, and came out with 4 more. Then again, and again, until one by one, every trapped civilian was outside. And Ethan, his gear scorched, his breathing ragged, his body on the verge of collapse, was still standing. And then, finally, the building gave way. The entire Varades central spire collapsed into itself, a final explosion of plasma sending shockwaves through the city. But there was not a single casualty, because Ethan had saved them all. The one who didn't run. Silence. No one knew what to say. The strongest firefighters of the Varades Empire had stood back, and the only being that had run toward the fire was a human. Commander Trelvex approached, mandibles clicking in awe. "I do not understand." Ethan removed his mask, inhaling deeply. He smiled. "I told you. Fire doesn't scare me." And for the first time in Varades history, they learned what it meant to be human. The Varades emergency crews had seen many things. They had watched entire cities burn, witnessed natural disasters rip apart worlds, and responded to catastrophes few could survive. But they had never seen anything like this, because the human should be dead. And yet Ethan Cole stood before them, still breathing. Smoke clung to his blackened turnout gear, his helmet cracked, his oxygen tank nearly empty. He had just done the impossible. And now the entire Varades Fire Corps stood in stunned silence, watching, waiting, because they knew. This wasn't just a rescue. This was something else. Something they could not comprehend. The weight of the moment. A young Varades firefighter, Rekavel, stepped forward hesitantly. She was still shaken. She had been the first to accept the fire as unbeatable. She had been one of the ones who had stood back, unwilling to die in a futile effort. Now, she could barely process what she had just witnessed. How did you do it?" Ethan, still catching his breath, just gave a tired chuckle. "One step at a time." Rekka swallowed hard. "No. That fire, plasma-grade temperatures. The fusion core was going critical, the air was unbreathable. You should be dead." Ethan shrugged. "Well, I'm not." And that was the part that scared them the most. The fire marshal speaks. Commander Trelvex finally stepped forward. The old Varades fire marshal had been on thousands of rescue calls. He had seen entire colonies wiped out. And for the first time in his long storied career, he had nothing to say. He just stared at the human. And then, he knelt. The entire Varades Fire Corps gasped. Because a Varades commander never bowed. Not to kings. Not to warlords. Not even to the High Council. But here, in front of a Terran firefighter, he lowered his head in respect. "Today I have witnessed courage beyond reason. You have no thermal shielding. You have no specialized anatomy to resist fire. And yet, you walked into the blaze and returned unscathed." Trelvex looked up. "This is not normal." His mandibles clicked in thought. "This is something greater." And then, "Teach us." The Varades firefighters stiffened. They were the best in the sector. They had trained for decades in fire suppression and emergency rescue. And yet, their leader was asking a human for guidance. The humiliation should have been unbearable. But it wasn't, because they had all seen the truth. And the truth was this: humanity feared nothing. The human way of firefighting. Ethan rubbed his face, thinking, "You guys aren't bad at firefighting, but you overthink it." The Varades blinked. "You have advanced technology, bioadaptive gear, hazard algorithms. But when you saw that fire, your brains told you it was a lost cause." He exhaled. "We don't think like that." Rekavel narrowed her eyes. "Then how do humans think?" Ethan's expression changed. The tiredness faded. The exhaustion disappeared. And for the first time, the Varades Fire Corps saw what made humanity different. Ethan's eyes burned brighter than the fire itself. "We think about who's still inside." The first lesson. The Varades Fire Corps spent the next 3 weeks learning human techniques, learning human philosophy, learning why, when the fires raged, the last ones running were always humans. Ethan taught them how to push past their instincts, how to read the fire, not fear it, how to understand the dangers but never accept defeat. Because to humans, fire was not an enemy. It was an adversary, a force to be fought, battled, and beaten into submission. And as the days turned into weeks, something incredible happened. The Varades began changing. The fire that should have won. 3 weeks later, a second plasma outbreak erupted. A different city. A different tower. Another unstoppable fire. Another no-win scenario. The Varades Fire Corps arrived at the scene. The civilians had already given up hope. Because before today they had always known, there was no stopping this kind of fire. But then, The Varades firefighters did something unthinkable. They charged in. The first fire without a human. For the first time in Varades history, they fought the fire without advanced biothermal shielding. They fought without hesitation. They fought with human techniques. They fought with human courage. And when the fire should have won, it lost. Because now the Varades knew something they hadn't before. That sometimes, it wasn't about having the best gear, or the best technology, or the best strategy. Sometimes, it was about having the will to step forward. And for the first time, the Varades did. The message that reached Earth. The success of the first all-Varades human-style rescue reached Earth within hours. And when it did, the fire departments of Earth responded. They sent messages of congratulations. They sent instructors to teach more. They sent firefighters to exchange training. And just like that, humanity had changed an entire species. Not through war. Not through force. Not through diplomacy. But by teaching them how to run into the fire. The one who didn't stop. Ethan stood at the edge of the new fire station, watching as the next generation of Varades firefighters trained. Commander Trelvex approached, mandibles clicking in amusement. "You changed us, human?" Ethan smirked. "No. You changed yourselves?" Recavel, now one of the leading trainees, turned and called out. "Instructor Cole, what's next?" Ethan cracked his neck, then smiled. "All right, kids. Let's see if you're ready for a real fire." And as they ran into the simulated inferno, the Varades firefighters moved without fear. Because they knew. Fire didn't scare humans. And now it didn't scare them either. The Varades homeworld was no stranger to disasters. Fires, earthquakes, plasma storms. They had seen them all. But this was unlike anything they had ever faced. The sky burns. It started with a rupture in the planetary defense grid. A reactor explosion in orbit station Vex 4 sent a cascade of energy surging through the atmosphere. A plasma storm ignited in the sky. Not just any storm. A firestorm. Fire falling from the heavens. It rained down onto cities, forests, oceans. A planetary-level disaster. And the Varades Fire Corps were called into action. Because there were no warships coming to save them. No galactic response force. No emergency relief ships. Just firefighters. And one human among them. The Varades stand alone. Ethan Cole stood shoulder to shoulder with the Varades commanders. The Fire Corps had evolved. 3 months ago, they would have evacuated. Now, they were ready to fight. Because they had trained for this. Because they had learned from the humans. And for the first time in history, they were going into a fire knowing they could win. The impossible mission. The capital city of Vexon was ground zero. The storm had torn through the skyline, and hundreds of thousands were trapped. The emergency command center crackled with static as reports flooded in. Entire districts collapsing. "We have people stranded on the upper levels of the arcologies. The central reactor is overheating. If it blows, the whole region is gone." The Varades looked to their leader. Commander Trelvex, once hesitant, now stood firm. And beside him Ethan Cole smiled. "All right. Let's go to work." The Grand Rescue. What followed was the most daring firefighting mission in galactic history. The Varades Fire Corps, led by human tactics, deployed in a planet-wide operation. Skyscrapers were evacuated using specialized high-rise extraction teams. Underground tunnels filled with plasma fire were flooded and cooled before civilians could be pulled out. Military dropships, once used for war, were converted into airborne fire suppression units. And at the heart of it, Ethan Cole led the most dangerous mission of all. The reactor descent. The planetary reactor core was seconds from a full detonation. If it went critical, it wouldn't just level the city, it would turn half the planet into glass. The fire suppression units couldn't reach it in time. The engineers had already fled. The command center was screaming for an evacuation. And then a single voice cut through the comms. "I'll do it." The entire command center fell silent. Recavel, now Ethan's second-in-command, shook her head. "No. That's suicide." Ethan just grinned through the visor of his fire helmet. "Nah. Just another fire." And then he jumped into the inferno. Inside the heart of the fire, the reactor core chamber was collapsing. The temperature was beyond anything a human suit should have handled. The plasma walls churned like a living beast. Every second was death. And Ethan charged forward anyway. "I need a manual override." The engineers screamed back through the comms. "There is no override. The system is too damaged." Ethan gritted his teeth. The heat was unbearable. His suit alarms were screaming warnings. His oxygen was running low. But his hands never stopped moving. Because firefighters don't stop. Because as long as there's someone to save, they keep going. The last chance. The only way to prevent the explosion was to reroute the energy manually. No machines. No AI. No remote control. Someone had to be there. And that someone was Ethan. Cole? You don't have time? Ethan just grinned. I always have time. And then, with a final twist of a burning control valve, he cut the detonation sequence. The reactor stabilized. The planet was saved. And as the power core dimmed, the last thing Ethan saw before passing out from exhaustion was the flames dying at his feet. The legend of the human firefighter. They pulled Ethan out of the ruins, his body burned, exhausted, broken, but alive. The Varades fire core gathered around, watching. Because today they hadn't just witnessed heroism. They had witnessed a legend. Because this wasn't just a firefighting mission. This was proof. Proof that humans don't run. Proof that humans don't quit. Proof that humans will stand against the impossible and still fight. And the galaxy would never forget it. The first of many. 3 days later, Ethan woke up in a medical bay. His body was healing. His mission was complete. And beside him, Rekha Vel sat with a data pad. She grinned. You're awake. Ethan groaned, sitting up. Barely. She handed him the data pad. He blinked. It was an application. Galactic Firefighter Academy, instructor status. Ethan looked at Rekha, confused. She smirked. You thought we'd let you leave after all this? Ethan chuckled. Didn't think I'd survive, honestly. Rekha nodded. Neither did we. But now? She gestured to the Varades fire core, waiting outside the med bay. Now we're ready for more. Ethan stared at the datapad. And then he signed his name. Because the fire wasn't done. And neither was he. The firefighter's legacy. Within months, the first intergalactic fire academy opened. Species from all over the galaxy came to train. And at the heart of it was the first human instructor. Ethan Cole. The man who ran into fire. The man who taught the galaxy how to fight it. The man who refused to be afraid. And across the stars, whenever a fire burned out of control, whenever civilians were trapped, whenever others would have fled, they called for one thing. Get me a firefighter from Earth. Because they knew. Humans don't fear fire. Fire fears them. The Intergalactic Fire Academy had become more than just a training ground. It was a symbol. A place where firefighters from every species came to learn what humanity had already mastered. How to run into the fire. How to fight back against impossible odds. How to never ever quit. And at the center of it all, the first human instructor stood, watching recruits go through the same grueling training he had endured on Earth. Ethan Cole. The call that changed everything. The recruits were in the middle of a high-rise rescue drill when the alarms blared. A real alarm. Not a simulation. The control tower's voice rang across the comms. Planetary distress signal detected. Origin, Raxon 3. Massive fuel refinery explosion. Fire covering 300 square kilometers and spreading. Millions at risk. The room went silent. This was worse than anything they'd faced before. And then, Ethan grabbed his gear. I'm going. The recruits looked at him in shock. Instructor Cole, it's a death trap. Ethan just smirked. Then we better move fast. And just like that, he was back in the fight. Into the inferno one last time. The team arrived on Raxon 3 within hours. What they found was hell itself. The entire fuel refinery sector had detonated, setting off secondary explosions for miles. Clouds of burning fuel choked the sky. Entire districts were collapsing under the heat. And thousands of people were still trapped. The local emergency crews had already given up. This fire was beyond anything they could control. But Ethan had heard those words before. And just like before, he refused to accept them. I need teams on every major containment point. We'll evacuate sector by sector. We're going to put this fire down. A Raxon commander, drenched in sweat, shook his head. That's suicide. Ethan turned, his eyes burning like the flames around him. Then it's a good thing I don't have time to die. And with that, he ran straight into the inferno. The last run. This fire was different. It wasn't just heat. It was chemical. The flames burned in shades of green and blue, fueled by volatile gases. And in the middle of the chaos, civilians were trapped in the lower refinery levels, cut off from the exits. Ethan pushed forward. His gear sensors overloaded. His breathing mask cracked. His lungs burned. But he kept going. Because as long as there were people inside, he wasn't leaving. The final rescue. By the time Ethan reached the last sector, his suit was barely holding together. But the last group of survivors, a Raxon family huddled behind a fallen steel beam, was still alive. He gritted his teeth, heaved the beam aside and pulled them free. "Let's go. Move." The fire was closing in. His oxygen tank was empty. His legs were giving out. And as they ran through the crumbling corridors, the exit was just meters away. And then, the roof collapsed. The last choice. There was no time to think. Ethan didn't hesitate. He threw himself forward, shoving the family toward the exit, shielding them with his body. The fire roared around him. The pain was unimaginable. But the family made it out. They turned, just in time to see Ethan vanish beneath the flames. The end of a legend. For hours the fire raged. The emergency crews kept fighting. And finally, the flames died. They found him beneath the wreckage. Burnt. Broken. But alive. Barely. And as they pulled him from the ruins, cheers erupted across the command center. Because against all odds, against every force in the universe that tried to kill him, Ethan Cole had survived. The firefighter who changed the galaxy. It took months for Ethan to recover. By the time he stood again, the galaxy had changed. Because what he had done wasn't just another rescue. It was a turning point. A moment where the entire universe realized what it truly meant to be human. The firefighter's legacy lives on. Ethan never went back into another fire. His body had given everything it had. But his spirit? That would never die. Because from that moment on, the title of firefighter became something greater. Entire alien worlds adopted human firefighting methods. Terran fire teams became the most respected emergency forces in the galaxy. And every time a fire broke out on a distant world, one phrase was whispered across the comms. "Find me a firefighter from Earth." Because the galaxy had learned one truth. Humans don't fear fire. Fire fears them. The end.